Welcome to the Retro 21 Studios podcast. I'm your host, M Squared. Please support the podcast by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons on our various podcast channels, such as Podbean, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. To support our efforts, please visit the Retro 21 Studios website at www.retro21studios.com and click on support. Welcome to the Retro 21 Studios podcast. I'm your host, M Squared. Today, I'm joined with Eric Hedberg, Quantitative Social Science Methodologist. How are you today, Eric?
Good. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Really appreciate you joining the show today.
Happy to be here.
Oh, thank you. The series has been, if you've caught some of the earlier episodes, it's all about AI, just the vast impacts of artificial intelligence. And it's not just getting under the hood of artificial intelligence. There's so many facets to it, how it's impacting folks who aren't necessarily mired in the technology. We're actually delving into responsible AI. And one of the earlier episodes, we delved in it from a criminal justice perspective. And so one of the feeders into AI is, of course, the data. There's a lot of conversation around the language models. There's the statistics behind the language models. And of course, there's this whole notion of algorithmic bias. It's not a notion, it's something that's very real. Eric, you're an expert in statistics. I just want to hand it over to you to provide some context around your background and get going here.
Awesome. Cool. I am a quantitative methodologist who has a degree in sociology, a doctorate in sociology, and I have fair number of papers on statistics and doing statistical methods and books about how to plan studies to make sure the inferences are reliable and what you think they are. And it started with being a poet in high school, actually. I have sort of an arts background. I was a theater nerd. I was in the plays and wrote this sort of really bad E. Cummings-like poetry that actually looks a lot like multi-level model equations, come to think of it. So maybe it is all the same thing. But got to college, I even did some modern dance. That was about 40 pounds ago. And more theater, and then English major. And then I started to have ideas and get into arguments and lost all my arguments because I was too young. And that was the reason why I lost the arguments, is I didn't know what Hemingway thought. And eventually I found my way into sociology, and I was really excited because when we took stat classes and we were looking at tables and numbers, and it's an objective fact. Great. Now I can win arguments and I can point at facts. Even got a doctorate in sociology, and I'm back to art again because all these statistics, all these models are just two-dimensional maps of a three-dimensional world, and they're no more truth than anything else people claim as truth. And there's a certain level of uncomfortableness you really have to accept and just realize that you have pretty good guesses, but you never know when you do anything with statistics. Mm-hmm. And to a certain extent, I've gotten somewhat cynical in that if one study shows something, I'm like, okay, maybe. And so that means there's a lot of these sort of social facts or a lot of these patterns that people claim you'll see on a news website. Study says whatever. I'm like, maybe. Mm-hmm. I believe racism. That's pretty well established. I believe sexism. I believe a lot of those things because it's been found again and again and again. Any kind of one-off study about standing a certain way and having a better day because of it, I'm a little more cautious about.
Eric, you mentioned certain things, racism, sexism,
right,
happening again and again. Is consistency in data statistics?
Yeah, if you really think about it, once it's digital, everything's data. I do a lot of work in education. And so a lot of times my colleagues and I will get a data set of kids and their test scores, and we run models to predict, do various gender groups or people who like Pokemon versus PlayStations do better or worse on math. But we quickly forget that those scores themselves are based on a whole other set of models. The scores we use for our kids are predictions from other models. And so, the results of statistical analyses then become data themselves, which then other models are run, which then there's people who will then do meta-analyses on the people who do the same types of studies based on test scores. So then those results become data. Everything is data. And one of the really big revolutions that's happened in the past 20 or 30 years with the digitization of everything else, we type words in emails. That's ultimately ones and zeros stored on a computer. We have pictures, we have movies, all of that's ones and zeros. And so all of that is data to be analyzed statistically. And so when you have this mindset that everything's data, you start really realizing how statistics and models and all the choices we make when we run those models impact our lives and impact the results of one analysis, which then becomes the grist for some other analysis. And so if you start making choices at the low end of the food chain, if there's mercury in that fish, there's going to be mercury in your beef too someday, right? And we have to take a very ecological point of view when we think of all of this data stuff. And I think there's a lot of risk involved in not reading the ingredient list of the data you take in, just like you should read the ingredient list of the food you eat.
That's an interesting point, Eric. And I'm just thinking about the whole thing around language models and selection of a language model for a specific purpose, right? OpenAI, it's a large corpus of the internet up to 2021. And then there's fine tuning. But therein lies that whole deal of what's important, what's relevant, and what's going to provide the information that's closer to the truth.
And how much of a role does the user have to play in what they're asking ChatGPT, right?
Yes.
And this technology came out roughly a year ago, and we all started playing around with it. And I admit, even I will log on about once a quarter and ask ChatGPT the questions I get at work. And I haven't panicked yet because how many schools do you need per treatment group to well power a study or something like that. And ChatGPT will give me what's more or less an average paragraph of stuff it's seen online. And it's a low-level undergrad answer, but then it usually will end with, you really should ask a real person about this. And so as long as it's doing that, I feel comfortable in my job. But it has its limits. For example, I recently wrote a paper that came out about half a year ago, on a really small technical issue of optimal number of kids per schools you need, say, for a cluster randomized trial. And I wrote in the beginning of that paper, because it's sort of part of my rhetorical style, of most people say you need about 30 kids per cluster. And then my next sentence was something to the effect of, that's a terrible idea. You should read this paper and do this thing, right? I asked Bing, Microsoft's ChatGPT, how many kids do I need per cluster? And it said, you need about 30. And it cited my paper and the first sentence that I wrote, but Bing obviously didn't have the intelligence to read the next sentence, in which I said, that's a terrible idea. So it was giving my rhetorical device of this is a terrible idea as the right answer. And so it's certainly artificial, and I don't know how quite intelligent it is. But it's doing exactly what it was programmed to do.
Eric, you read the disclaimer. There's definitely a disclaimer on ChatGPT. Hey, you know what? This information may not be accurate. You better double check it.
There's a disclaimer on cigarettes too, but I didn't quit till I was 25. Sure, there's a disclaimer. There's that, and then there's the real use cases that in aggregate have major impacts on society. And that's the thing that kind of keeps me up at night.
So in that instance where you actually have a paper and it references a paper and it didn't go beyond, right, the headliner, what do you do? So from a user perspective, say I was on ChatGPT and it came across to me. So just some advice, because people are readily going to the tool. They don't read the disclaimer and they walk away with, this is fact, and I'll put it in a paper, or I'll use it in a speech.
Or what I did when I saw that is I literally typed back, I wrote this thing and you're wrong. And I think it actually ended the session. I think it appears I made it mad, but I didn't make it mad. I probably it thought that I was ending the conversation. It was predicting that this is the end of the conversation. But most users won't be the authors of the things it cites incorrectly, and so they won't be writing that back. Now, to the credit of the geniuses who've come up with this thing, there's these more complicated, these sort of transformer models where there's this Bayesian feedback loop that gets built into them. And so theoretically, users can say, no, bad AI, and it should take that in. And if it takes that in enough, it'll start doing better. And that would be certainly a highly democratic model of the users training the AI model. You need a well-informed population using this that has a demographic, not a demographic, but a democratic urge to, correct the model when it's wrong.
Right.
It also requires a well-informed, educated population that knows the model's wrong, and I don't know if we're quite there right now. Right. And I think back to, and I don't know if this is actually fact, this is stories that I would hear my parents tell, but apparently cruise control in cars came out in the 70s. I think there was a joke on Anchorman about this, actually, Anchorman 2. But cruise control came out on cars, and people did not really understand what it was doing. It was only just holding the gas pedal. Wasn't doing any steering, wasn't doing any thinking. Cruise control sounded pretty fancy in Star Trek, and so people would turn it on and then get in the back seat. I don't know what they do, maybe have a smoke or something. And then there was a lot of car accidents because people didn't understand the technology. And I'm sure, to the disclaimer notion, sure in the car manual, under the glove box, under all the napkins, it's clearly said, don't leave your hands off the wheel when you turn this on. So, no one ever read that stuff, and there were more car accidents.
It's interesting you say that. You're reaching back to your parents. Think about the Tesla, right? The autopilots in the cars right now. And it's, look, keep your hands on the steering wheel. Yes, I will steer. I have forward-looking radar. I have a LiDAR, all that good stuff. And there's lots of accidents because that wasn't the intent of the tool. So it's an even finer line today.
It's interesting. There's a sort of bimodal distribution of complexity with a lot of this stuff. And I think a lot of people are having trouble getting, even experts are having trouble getting their heads around it. There's a really good book by Stephen Wolfram, who wrote Mathematica, the computing language, and Wolfram script. And it's certainly a tool that I've used a lot in my life, especially to do some of my calculus homework. But he wrote this great little book. It's $14, and the title was like, "What is ChatGPT and why does it work?" or something to that effect. And it's written at a really nice level where if somebody's even had a couple of stat classes or even just one undergrad stat class in a social science, they know enough to follow this book and follows the logic of how these large language models are working. And what I love is the end of the book where it basically comes to the conclusion of the reason this works is not because we've had some major breakthrough in theoretical thinking about this or computer science. The reason this works is ultimately language isn't that hard. Because all these large language models are doing is they've been trained on a ton of data, and then you give it an input which sort of stands in as its sort of set of predictors, and it gives its best guess what the outcome's going to be. And what it's doing is just putting one word in front of the other of the next most likely word. It's not thinking meaning, and it's just. And the problem is, if you've ever seen the weather report during hurricane season, you'll always see the path of the hurricane, and it has this sort of funnel that goes out. It's because we're pretty sure where the hurricane's going to be tomorrow, and we're less sure, but still reasonably sure where it's going to be the next day. But 10 days out, there's this big gap. That gap is not because the hurricane's getting bigger. The gap is because we really don't know what the future holds. And so we think it's going to be somewhere between here and here. What I would like to see large language models do is visually do the same kind of level of unsureness and have the words get lighter as the sentence goes on, as it's becoming less and less sure what the next word is going to be, because it's guesses built on guesses. You see this phenomena in college courses. When you ask a student who hasn't read the assignment what they thought of it, they'll start strong and and then their voices just get really high as they're completely BSing. Their confidence interval is getting huge. And I would like to see that graphically with the output from these large language models, because by the time you get to the last sentence, it's a wild guess.
That's an awesome visual with the college students. You talked about seeing towards the future, right? So this isn't just AI. So can you talk a little bit about predictive analytics? Because that seems to have preceded AI. Did it play into it? What's that whole distinction?
So predictive analytics is various versions of sort of your run-of-the-mill regression. You have some outcome like how many tires are you going to sell this week at your tire store? And then you have a bunch of other information day by day that goes along with how many tires you sold. And you basically run a model and it creates the best conditional average day for day based on the other information, like what was the weather that day? What were gas prices that day? How many employees did you have? Did you have Johnson, who's really good at selling tires that day? That sort of stuff. And it makes predictions. And the idea is to basically try to cut through all the noise and find a functional form that relates all the stuff you know about the predictors and try to make a good prediction on your outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And data science has come a long way in figuring all sorts of fancier ways to get a better box of prediction coefficients. There used to be just linear least squares that was originally invented because people couldn't figure out where Jupiter was, and they realized no one person was right, but everyone's right when you average them. That's why I love statistics. It's very democratic that way. No one person's right, but everyone is. And then there's these more advanced sort of shrinkage models and things where it tries to stop overfitting, because the problem with these sort of old stat models is you could make a really good prediction and have the most accurate prediction of everything that happened up until that point. And then Martians land the next day and its predictions are totally off.
Right.
Because Martians weren't here the day before. Not that I think there's Martians.
You have that historical data, right?
But you get what I'm saying. And a lot of these sort of new algorithms are doing what they can to avoid those traps of peculiar bits in any one data set really driving the message. And then a lot of predictive analytics do things like they split the data and they say, we'll run the model here and we'll see how well it predicts on the other half to try to avoid some of those things. And so large language models are a mega version of that, but instead of predicting numbers of tires with what's the weather temperature that day, it's predicting words, and it's using natural language processing. And this used to be a harder discussion prior to Facebook and social networks and Meta, but now everyone has a pretty good sense of what a network is. Mm-hmm. And if you think about language and words, a lot of what these data ultimately are networks of co-occurring words. And when you take like a Python data science course and you do the natural language hour or whatever, or day or week, one of the things they do is they say, okay, we don't know what the quality of these movies. We don't know their sort of 1 to 5 scale, but we have enough data where people rated it and then wrote stuff down. And so what we can do is if people don't want to rate it, but they still wrote stuff down, we could use the words to make a prediction as to how many stars, 1 to 5. And it turns out if they write the words right next to each other, Steven Seagal, the number of stars tends to be a little bit lower. Right. And so it's this network of co-occurring words and this constellation of words that then can be related to either other constellations of words or other things. And a lot of what happens is you create these sort of what they call neural networks, which is really just pattern recognition and trying to break down a paragraph into every word and the positions of the word. And you usually have to train it on something. Mm-hmm. So when I ask a large language model a question about statistical power, even though I don't say statistical power, I'll say, what's the required sample in order to get a statistically significant effect? I'm not saying power, but I'm saying words that tend to go along with power in all the written material out there.